we understand enough about the science to be able to call out particular compounds and understand that that's going to provide something that most folks, palates are very individual, so I try not to tell people what they taste, but that most folks are going to taste and describe in a given way, and whether that's a flavor that you might call biscuits or almondy or fruity or bananas, like we understand those flavors chemically well enough to find those precursors and to know where they come from, and if they're grain derived, we can speak to the extent to which you might find that in the finished product based on their presence at this point in the raw material, which is really cool.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, everybody? Welcome back for another episode of the Decoding Cocktails podcast. As always, I'm still Chris LeBeau, and today my guest is Heyward Gualandi of Root Shoot Malting. Root Shoot is a fifth-generation farm in Loveland, Colorado, which is north of Denver. And in 2016, in a move to save the farm from the realities of modern-day commodity farming, more on that in a minute, Todd, Emily, and Steve Olander aimed to make their venture more profitable by adding on a grain malting facility. So while we are all beneficiaries and recipients of the agricultural system, few of us, including myself, really understand it. So I want to lay a bit of a ground game just to make sure that we kind of all catch up right here. So a huge portion of our agricultural system is based on commodity crops like corn, soy, wheat, and other grains. The tough part about this, beyond a lack of diversity, which can strip nutrition out of the soil, which can lead to need for fertilizer and increase the likelihood of disease in crops, is that the farmer also in this situation absorbs a huge portion of the risk. So when you're selling a commodity crop, you are subject to a market price, which is often designed to do less favors for the farmer, shall we say. And as you'll hear Heyward talk about, there are moments when a farmer is also having their crop evaluated, and through a couple of quick tests, if they're not approved at a certain standard, very quickly their crop intended for human consumption could be dictated for animal consumption, and the price will drop precipitously. So this is part of the risk of commodity crops. So I mentioned that their name is Root Shoot Malting. So why did they add a malting facility, and what exactly is malting? So in a way, malting is really taking a grain, for example, like wheat or any seed like that, and sprouting it. And the sprouting of the seed, which is done in a controlled manner, takes many of the starches inside there and begins to convert them into sugars. And this is required for the fermentation process, a la beer and whiskey. The price for malted grains is also often many times higher than for the grain itself. So they made a conscious decision to add a malting facility to get off the commodity market, and which allows them to sell directly to breweries. And this is where someone like Heyward comes in. So when you're on the commodity market, you can just drive up to a wholesaler and sell your crop. But if you want to sell it for more, you need to figure out who your customers are going to be. And so as they've moved into markets like into beer and whiskey, for example, they need to not only drum up interest, but to hear what is on the mind of brewers and distillers that are out there. So here are a couple of takeaways from my conversation. I also sat in on a panel discussion before Heyward and I chatted, which helped me kind of better get myself oriented for things. So we will hit on this during the conversation, but something that I found valuable to think about is for the distillers and brewers out there looking for a competitive edge, going to a farmer or small maltster is another way to find a competitive advantage. a dish is only as good as the quality of the raw ingredients you start with. And rather than starting with the grain itself, when you start with the people who are putting the seeds directly into the ground, like root shoot, for example, they control a huge portion of the process. They control what seed grows in the ground, not based on some commodity market. They also control the malting process. So as you'll hear Heyward talk about, they're constantly in conversation with their customers about like, hey, what do you think about this? And as a farmer also on the panel said, in terms of, this takes an additional initiative in terms of the brewer, the distiller, but a lot of farmers will also like to have more diversity in their crops. It's safer for them, and also many of them are excited about this kind of thing. This conversation also had a lot of echoes for me from one I had a while back with Hannah Williams and Donovan Ingram at Blue Hill Farm, which I'll link to. The quality of the beer and the whiskey comes as much down to the quality of the ingredient as we think of with wine. This comes from the quality of the seed, which is directly impacted by the quality of the soil in which it is grown. As the writer Michael Pollan has once said, we are what we eat eats. And thinking more about this as people like Heyward and the team are, the question is, as we think about that, is what we're is that food that we're having eating, fertilizer and pesticides, or is it eating valuable, tasty, organic matter imparted by other crops that they've grown with in terms of preserving that soil? This is a great conversation. You can learn more about Root Shoot at rootshootmalting.com or at rootshootmalting on Instagram. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy this conversation. So Heyward, first, thanks for taking the time and being kind of the last minute kind of a jump in here. I'd love to hear. As I was kind of getting ready for the conference, it was cool to dig into Root Shoot's background. Tell us a little bit about the history of the farm, and we'll kind of roll with things from there.
Sure, yeah. So Root Shoot Malting was founded on Olander Farms by Todd Olander and his wife Emily. Todd's a fifth generation on that farmer. They are on that land. They've been farming that land since the mid-late 1920s in the family. The malt house is, at this point, not quite 8 years old when we commissioned the malt house. And it really was built as a way, not to sensationalize, but it really was built as a way to save the farm. We were operating very much kind of contract malting barley growing for some large maltsters and brewers in Colorado. And that's a tough game. And so Todd sort of saw an avenue to take the farm direct to the producer, and rather than selling sort of commodity malting barley, to sell the story of the farm and to sell a finished malt barley, malt rye, malt wheat, malt oats, finished product to the end producer, primarily brewers and distillers. Yeah, raw corn.
Because one of the things we had talked quite a bit about earlier today was to kind of segue into some of the stuff you guys are doing right now is a huge portion of agriculture, again, being outside my depth, is a large commodity-based market. Mm-hmm. And so one that can often kind of reduce the scope of flavor that's available. But one of the things even we need to think about, especially in an era where people are thinking, in theory, maybe at least a little bit more about farms in the world of local food and whatnot, is so often so much of the risk is pushed onto the farmer from like a pricing perspective and all sorts of things. So that's kind of what Todd was up against, as you're saying, is that he was kind of in a commodity market, and it was kind of harder to sustain the farm in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. The pricing is sort of dictated to the farmer. Farmers are going to absorb the risk. You have one opportunity to plant. You have seasons of growth, and you have one opportunity to harvest. If you've got a bad hail year, or you have a difficult moisture or rain year, you have protein levels climbing, and a maltster is rejecting your barley. You're staring at selling feed barley for a fraction of the price. So farmers absorb a lot of that risk. Yeah, I guess I don't know. There was a lot to that question.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, and if at times ever, also the question is a good one, run with it in any direction. But yeah, I remember you saying that there can be just this moment of judgment almost for the farmer when they're submitting their product to a wholesaler, and like in that moment they're going to learn whether they're going to get the price they expected or what you said, a third or something like that.
Yeah, it depends on the year, but fraction anyway.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
just pushing all the risk there. And so one of the things that Root Shoot is doing today, and we can talk about some of the grains, but by becoming a maltster yourself, you're kind of more now, to use the proper term you said, not the proper term, but the term you said earlier, vertically integrated. You don't have to worry about, is a maltster going to accept this? You guys can grow the grains you want and then bring it to malting fruition.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of people talk a lot about 2-row and 6-row barley, and those are broad categories kind of describing the structure of the plant, but the point is there are numerous varieties of 2-row and numerous varieties of 6-row barley, and farmers are going to choose which seed they're going to plant this year, typically with the hopes of selling to a maltster. They're going to be taking, let me say this differently, they're going to be spending a lot more time and energy on a process side, farming a malting quality barley, which is to say a barley with a relatively low protein content versus the starch in there, which is more difficult, right? Irrigation required, water required, time. And so farmers are going to be staring that down, making a selection of seed variety to choose, and then taking and hoping that they're going to find a maltster who wants to buy it. We're fortunate in that we're doing both of those things, right? So we're making those decisions about variety in concert with Mike in the malt house, having those discussions. If we understand some things about a particular variety, whether it's water sensitivity or another sort of agronomic or malting related trait, we can decide whether we would like to engage with that variety before we ever go to plant. And so we are planning this. I mean, for winter barley crop, for example, we're planting in late fall into early winter. Ideally in that September zone, we're going to get a harvest the following summer. And then we're generally growing and malting varieties that retain a dormancy trait, so we're having then to store that barley for another couple of months, give or take, prior to being able to malt with it. So for example, with regards to these malting winter barleys, they went into the ground 22 in the fall.
Really?
Harvest them summer 23. First malting trials are winter 23 after we've already replanted next year's crop.
Okay.
So we're allocating acreage, trying to figure out yield, figuring out what we're going to have in terms of raw materials to malt with the following year, before we have any feedback of our own with regards to how we enjoy working with the barley and malting it,
right.
Or from our producer partners who are using it and providing that same feedback. So yeah, it's a protracted timetable.
Wow. Now, so if you were working with a larger brewery beforehand, buying more like the product they expect or whatnot, so one, they might be more dictating the price, but so you open the malt house. Are Todd and Emily and the team at that point in time already knowing they want to move in a direction of different crops, or is it just knowing that if we can keep it in here up until the malting process, we can then try to find a buyer that's willing to pay better prices? So in terms of thinking about it as a core business decision, was there immediately grains that we were trying that were different ones, or was it really more about if we control more of the chain, we can better dictate a better price to maybe the right buyer?
It's kind of both of those things.
Okay.
All of the above, really. Certainly the barley varieties, when the family was farming on contract, predominantly for Coors and Anheuser-Busch Colorado malting facilities, those contracts were mostly dictated varieties, right? And in some cases proprietary varieties that we wouldn't be able to plant as an independent farmer. So we get to make those decisions on our own. Some varieties, as I mentioned, are owned and they're not They're not available to us. We can't buy that seed.
Right.
But in some cases, we get to choose between a number of potentially very good options, many of which grow great here in Colorado. But then you definitely touched on something with regards to the value add. The price in a 50-pound bag of malted barley to a brewer or distiller is, many times, I say many times, most cases more than double what you might sell your grain bulk raw to a large maltster, and in some cases in excess of that, right? So it's definitely, by integrating vertically and by going direct to the consumer. We don't have a distributor. I mean, if a brewery or a distillery is using root shoot malt, we probably brought it to them in our big truck. And
right.
Ian drove it over there, and we dropped it off. And maybe they gave us a bottle of whiskey and said thanks. It's really great to have those relationships. We're for the most part working with much smaller organizations, receiving that feedback directly from them, and because of our size and scale, we're able to act on that feedback. We're able to internalize that, whether it's planting a new variety of corn, trialing some corn varieties with the family Jones, or we're experimenting with barley varieties that don't have husks on them, for distillers who are interested in increasing their barley usage but reluctant to drive husk due to tannin content. So there's a lot of cool things that can happen on the farm that, I think Jason Cody at Colorado Malting Company was in talk today at the conference and mentioned the distiller's toolbox, he liked to call it.
That's right. Yeah. I thought that was cool. Yeah. In terms of leaning on the farmer for that. Yeah. And there's so many things here. I think one at the highest level, I remember. So in addition, we talked about the risks posed to a farmer in commodity in terms of some of the risk being pushed onto them. But at the same level, it's interesting. And we were talking about the inverse of in an era of time when a lot of people are more asking about where did this come from? Who made it? We're still seeing the decrease of the farmer. And so for the distiller, by leaning on the farmer, one, you can have a better conversation about flavor. How was this product treated? It's easier to have it verified in terms of what the contents are. But yeah, being able to, as a distiller, ask the questions of hey, I want something that has more characteristics like this. Or, hey, I saw this person using this rye over in New England. Could we do that? You are paying a quote-unquote premium if you're working with a small farm, but there's greater visibility into what you're able to work with. And an easier conversation, because chances are you're talking to a giant grain dork at that point too, who's going to be like, "What's that? Somebody wants to talk about."
Call me?
Is that an insult right there? But I think a lot of those are probably the perks on the other end, especially as
absolutely.
Craft distillers want to stand out.
Yeah, it's added value. Absolutely. I mean, you touched on a thing, and I want to make it really clear. We're talking about disappearing farms, or the average farmer in this country, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but we're talking something on the order of 65 years old. Young people are not entering farming. The average size of a farm in this country is continuing to increase in big ways. Small people are getting out. I mean, the message that a lot of farmers are receiving, by sometimes in the policy space, and other times just in doing business as a farmer, are get big or get out.
Right.
And that's what's happening. Little farms are selling to big farms. Big farms are planting one crop over the entire space. And in that way, we're losing so much of the variety that we used to have.
Yep, because industry is often set up to be an efficiency mechanism is yield driven. Yeah. And I had this in a previous conversation we'll link out to, but the restaurateur Dan Barber likes to say industry is set up for yield, and when he began to ask farmers to grow for flavor, they said nobody's ever asked us that before. And and this idea that if we don't respect the heritage of the soil and the grain, much like, again, and I think people get it a little bit more in the wine world for some reason.
Sure.
You know, the provenance of the grape and like, oh, look at this beautiful vineyard. But the same thing is like, you know, the flavor that came out of that grain ultimately you're using for your whiskey or your beer, you know, sure, like the seed matters, but so does the content of the soil, and is the game set up to encourage the farmer to invest in those things as opposed to how do we grow as much as possible?
Yeah, the game's not set up to encourage that of the farmer, but we're lucky in that we have partner producers, especially here in Colorado and certainly beyond, who have those interests and who are interested in doing that. They're playing outside of the rules of the game a little bit, incoming directly to folks like us, and they're helping us to be able to accomplish that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, as I mentioned, we're direct to producer. We don't have a distributor layer in the middle. Even once we have our malt completed,
right?
You know, we're direct from the farm to the malt house, and we're direct from the malt house to the producer. And I think that the message is that, you know, whiskey is no less an agricultural product than wine.
Right.
Right. And if you know you're drinking a Pinot Noir, you know you're drinking a Cabernet, what kind of rye is that in your rye whiskey?
Right.
Do you know that? Where was it grown?
Yep.
It does matter.
And I think it's more that like we have, it can be, it's not less terroir driven. We've either used ingredients or we've just resigned ourselves to thinking that it's less terroir driven. But when we use good soil, good grain, good farming practices, the terroir really does begin to have that impact. Like how can this taste so much better? It's like, well, likely we cared at the start of the chain, right? We're talking about this with agave and with sugarcane today. But if we use those same practices with whiskey or beer, you can have a diversity of flavor.
Oh, absolutely, and it is driven by where you are. Sarah Jones at Jones Farm Organics was talking this morning about sort of the idea of not necessarily picking a cool thing because it's cool and seeing if a local farmer can grow it, but more like going to that farmer and finding out, hey, what's an historically local ingredient, right? So what kinds of ryes were folks growing out here previously? What before we imported our high yield varieties? What sorts of grain crop were folks growing in this region of Colorado? Or what sorts of barley varieties were we growing here in the upper Midwest and places like that, right? So by going down that path, you start to look at the history of it. You start to get away from that yield driven model.
Yep.
And back to sort of what we'd had here, right? And I think it's important to bear in mind the history in this country with Prohibition, and we set ourselves back in a big way with that because we turned off all the stills, right, for years, and when we turned them back on, the conversation was only about yield.
Yep.
Because we were so far behind that whiskey was disappearing as fast as it could be made. Folks didn't have the time to lay it down for extended, aging periods. And it was just get it going, get it out, make it as fast as possible, because we can't make it fast enough. And it's all tied in. Certainly that's not the case across the board, but it is a big part of the story. And it's not unique to whiskey. We were tearing out cider apple trees in this country, and we decimated our variety of apples available to us to grow in this country when we thought it was a bad idea to drink alcoholic apple juice.
Another thing that came up too, that again at a level that you guys are aware that I'm not, is that you can take something like a term that we're used to, that maybe in some levels is a commodity, like number 2 dent corn. But as Todd was saying earlier, like, we've worked with other varietals that are going to have different starch counts, protein counts, and like also perform better in one environment versus another.
Absolutely.
Or as I think you said it was Sarah. Sarah was talking about potatoes. Like, I mean, in addition to these ones being local to the area, and we can certainly talk about the changing climate and how that impacts the way the farm thinks about itself, these potatoes right here taste better, look cooler, and they use less water.
Right.
And so all of these...
Which we're always worried about in
Right,
Colorado.
exactly. And so all of these things are like when you're willing to ask the farmer, like, oh, hey, what grows well here? Or what could we mess with that's more like of historical provenance, as opposed to like, as someone was trying to ask, they're like, oh, how do we bring in this cool corn from Mexico? It's like, hey, maybe we should look at like what cool corns actually exist from Colorado we just don't use anymore.
Right. Yeah, I think that question came from somebody who was operating in New England. I'm trying to remember. I might be wrong about that, but yeah, there's certainly plenty of really neat, heirloom varieties that had been grown in that part of the country previously. And yeah, there may be some really neat, tortilla corns that you could. He was a chef, I think, that are grown in Mexico. But I have a hunch you could probably find something that's been a native variety, practically wherever you live.
Yeah.
In this country.
So we'll talk about beer and whiskey in a minute because that's why we're all here, of course. But I would also be interested to talk about, like, more holistically, however you want to tackle it, the conservation easement that you guys have put down over the land. However you want to talk about that with respect to, like, respecting the land, but also, of course, the regenerative agriculture piece. And it came up today, too. Much like we've seen with the term organic, you can kind of greenwash with this too a little bit. So like to talk a little about like what you guys are doing to try to like protect that land for the future.
Yeah, so through Todd and Emily's work with Colorado Open Lands, the Olander Farms farm is now under a permanent conservation easement, which is to say that those acres will be agricultural use, even in the event that the farm is sold. Which is awesome.
Yeah.
And we're fortunate enough to be farming on additional leased acreage in our area that's also under permanent conservation easement.
Okay.
And it's increasingly difficult, especially in the Colorado Front Range, for a number of reasons. But the development is so fast and furious that landowners are looking at the pennies that we're going to give them to lease their acreage for farming and comparing that to what they could get to sell it and develop it.
Right.
And it's not comparable. We can't compete on price. We have to compete on values. And I think that folks, at least some landowners, are recognizing the value of continuing to have agriculture in these places, despite the fact that people want to live here and despite the fact that some developer wants to put up homes. We can't have homes everywhere. We need to farm some areas, and we have great space for that. But you're right, we're facing a changing climate. We're facing more difficulty than just land availability. Water has always been a big one in Colorado. And so one of our responses to that is to improve our soil quality. And so, yeah, there's a lot of buzzwords flying around. But to us, regenerative agriculture just means growing organic matter in topsoil rather than depleting it over time. So we know that growing things improves topsoil, but if we're monoculturing and we're spraying and we're Roundup Ready corn and we're spraying pesticides, we'll get good yield and we'll get depleting topsoil. So we're trying to avoid tillage, which is to say we're trying to avoid turning up the soil. When we plant, we use seed drills.
Wow.
We drop them in rather than turning up the entire topsoil layer. When you turn that up, you'll expose active living microbes to air, to light, to wind, to extreme temperature, and they don't survive that. So when you maintain that cycle of life, when you're keeping photosynthesis active on a parcel of land for as many months as is possible in your space, right, wherever you live, that soil will respond in positive ways. And the result of that is resiliency. The result of that is the ability to take more water when we do get those rainstorms, because it's feast or famine here. We're either deluge or it's dry for 2 months. And when we do get that rain, the soil can take it. We've seen some neighboring farms right near our spaces whose topsoil is washing away in this rain, and we're watching our land soak that moisture up and have the capability to store it such that our crops have access to it beyond the time that the particular day or two in which it's raining, right? So for us it's a lot of things, but it's improving organic matter, soil health, quantity of topsoil, quality of topsoil, grazing cattle rather than spraying nitrogen, right? Lots of things.
The term cover crop has been thrown around on the show before, but I think what's interesting is for somebody, again, for me, looking from the outside in, what's this cover crop for? Well, the first thing is to keep the topsoil in place, but now as well, the cover crop can also be something that is also good for the land, but is also, like you were talking earlier, I think about, was it either a winter wheat or a rye, but anyways, but something you guys can stand certain cold temperatures, so that you can also have crops that you could potentially grow in the cold months too, right there. So makes it a little bit easier to hopefully keep the farm going.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of demand for spring planted barley, but rye is really cool stuff, and all those winter planted varieties, as I mentioned, having active photosynthesis in late winter months goes a long way. So if we know that we're planting, say, spring barley onto a plot, right, we're going to be planting cover crops in the fall prior to that, after we've harvested last year's crop. Those things are going to include peas. Those are great nitrogen fixers. Some annual ryegrasses, things like that, where we can keep active photosynthesis going. Maybe we can replenish a little bit of nitrogen, which is going to be depleted by corn and barley, while we're at it, and then we can graze the cows over those greens. Turnips are great for soil decompaction, and we're just going to allow that turnip, which is a root vegetable, to decompose in the soil, right? That's going to add organic matter to the soil. It's going to decompact the soil. There's a lot of advantages to it.
Yeah. Were you, I would imagine you're close to it or whatever, but something came up in the talk today was the Rye Resurgence Project.
Yeah.
What in the hell nerd grain thing is this thing?
All right, so I have a little less perspective on this one. There was a meeting yesterday that I wasn't able to attend. We had to split our team, and that wasn't my assignment. But I know that Sarah Jones at Jones Family Organic Farms, San Luis Valley, has had a lot to do with it. They're growing some really neat, sort of local, shall we say, heirloom varieties, or and finding some of the benefits of rye with regards to soil health, with regards to resiliency. I probably shouldn't get too far because I can't speak too much to the Rye Resurgence Project.
Totally fine.
Yeah.
But obviously also, and we certainly witnessed this in the longer term with whiskey as a category, but bourbon, but now suddenly rye is and so so in terms of also, as we've been talking about varietals too, tapping more interesting varieties of rye, and I think one of Sarah's lines when that was you can, I think she said you can drink your whiskey while you also eat it too,
rye bread,
yeah, exactly, and so being able to have it in these different forms is interesting as well. Now getting into it, because you let me taste some of the. I'm trying to think what how we would even call it. Essentially, it was a grain tea earlier.
Yeah, malt tea. Yeah, we'll call them hot steeps.
Yeah, and
functionally malt tea.
And so earlier I got to taste you let me taste some of the actual grains themselves, and the grain teas that you had steeped as well. But when you guys finally started kind of deploying your heirloom, or heirloom's the term you use, your grains into the beer and whiskey space, or distilling space, what was some of the feedback you heard? I'm sure you can taste the difference, but tell us about that a little bit in terms of what the reception has been on those things so far.
Yeah, really, really positive for the most part. But our model is one, again, of direct and of relationships, and so that feedback loop has been really, really important, I think, to us developing sort of our identity and also to drive us towards quality. We've been fortunate enough to work with extremely great producers who are going to push us, whether it's on the farm side, to experiment with different varieties, be they corn or rye, barley, and then also to push us to produce something in the malt house that fits their needs, right?
Yeah.
So we've gotten plenty of great feedback. I would call out Station 26 Brewing Company. I think we have a pale malt that really is what it is, because they make an IPA called Juicy Banger, and they wanted it to be as good as it could possibly be. And they would say, hey, that was great. Can we get a little bit more on the toast side? Can you express a little bit of dryness here? And we would change our malting parameters and send it back to them, and they would brew with it, and they would say, okay, cool, we like that. Back it off a little bit, not quite that much. And it was just a great feedback loop with local producers who are really trying to make something as well as they're able to, and using our capabilities to do that, right? I mean, we know what we like. That doesn't mean it's going to be the best thing for every given product that somebody's going to try to make, but we're happy to work with folks who are really interested in dialing something in. It just makes us better.
Yeah. Yeah, that certainly seemed to be part of like the whole conversation today. It was a fun back and forth, and I remember too saying the feedback you're getting. One of the people that had asked a question, I don't remember, but one of the other gentlemen on the panel had talked about that there was a kind of some kind of grain flavor wheel or something like that. And he was just saying, he goes, it's a little thing. He goes, but there's a lot of science behind it. And so using these things to think about the flavors that are possible based on these things was cool.
Yeah, we understand enough about the science to be able to call out particular compounds and understand that that's going to provide something that most folks' palates are very individual. So I try not to tell people what they taste, but that most folks are going to taste and describe in a given way. And whether that's a flavor that you might call biscuits or almondy or fruity or bananas, like we understand those flavors chemically well enough to find those precursors and to know where they come from. And if they're grain derived, we can speak to the extent to which you might find that in the finished product based on their presence at this point in the raw material, which is really cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That was Cody, Jason Cody, I believe, at Colorado Malting Company. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think like it's cool just as we see the distilling, and I mean the brewing industry is obviously still way light years ahead, but as we see distilling kind of come into its own light, like the more that distillers try to like actively chase down these relationships with local farmers, one, as came up again also, I think you said Jason said during it, like one, they kind of, a lot of them, hopefully, many of them would like to have this kind of conversation because they're looking to have a more diverse array of products, perhaps in addition to also enjoying the conversation sometimes. But yeah, so for a distiller that wants to get more creative, the first thing is like daring to try to go upstream more to look for unique products and ultimately the people growing it, as opposed to trying to make all the magic happen in their distilling warehouse,
Yeah, I mean, grain doesn't come from a bag, right? We grow that.
Yep.
And there are a lot of elements to it, and I think being able to walk that upstream, like you say, and follow that line, and understand a little bit more about what you're working with, only allows you to be more creative. It only allows you as a producer of spirit to dial in what you're trying to do. You're just peeling back the layers of the onion a little bit and understanding that you have way more control. Well, let me say that differently. You have the opportunity to go back to the source.
Yep.
Yeah.
Random, just a side question on like, and this, I don't know if it's too technical or not, but like, so I've always been aware that like number 2 dent corn, and we've talked already about like the fact that there's a lot of varieties of that.
Sure.
in my mind, I've always heard that very rarely is that ever going to be the kind of corn that would end up like in a grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
If you move into different varieties, is it, again, a lot of this conversation could be because, well, you bought from a wholesaler or whatever, but is number 2 dent corn, is that actually corn that one would ever sit down with, or is that something? Okay, it is. Okay.
Yeah, so that's that. You're mostly describing sweet corn, and the big difference is just what's in it, right? What's in the kernel.
Yep.
For our taste buds, we want to eat corn that's nice and sweet.
Yep.
And so that's sugar content. Whereas most of what we're growing for distillers is going to be grown for starch. Most of what we might grow for feed is going to be grown for protein, because that's what those feed animals are going to need, right?
Got it. Okay.
Yep, and so that'll impact varietal choice, but it'll also impact farming practices and how you go about it.
So I don't know if we could talk about this for a minute too. And at any point in time we're drifting off, if there's anything you want to jump in, let me know. But like, I want to talk about GMO for 1 minute too, if we could as well, because I thought it was cool. Like, I think it was Todd who was saying earlier that, deploying like cows or some kind of livestock with like non-GMO versus Roundup Ready corn, they go right to the non-GMO piece right here. And, so you have industry over here thinking about how do we grow as much as possible. But at the end of the day, how do you guys think about non-GMO in terms of flavor, safety? What would you tell a lay person like me about non-GMO product?
Well, I think we want to be a little bit careful.
Good. No, please.
Just because there's a lot to that. We choose to grow a non-GMO corn. We think, we would like to avoid spraying it at all times and in all places if at all possible. With a Roundup Ready type corn, you can spray it and knock back competition. You can knock back weed, right? And ostensibly the plant isn't bothered by those chemicals. Still all over the plant, right? And to think that those chemicals are not found in trace amounts when we go move forward downstream to make a food product, I think is silly, right?
Sure.
We are finding those chemicals, we are finding those pesticides in our food, because we're choosing to farm in a way that covers the plants and those pesticides. And then we eat them. It turns out that's not necessarily always that good. I'll go ahead and go a little further. That's generally not good.
Yeah.
Right. And so for us, I think you were alluding to Todd's story relatively early in the journey towards a more sort of sustainable, regenerative approach to farming on the farm. There was still some Roundup Ready corn that we were growing, and we were growing it mostly for silage, which is basically fermented cattle feed.
Okay.
Silage corn is cut at high moisture. The whole plant is taken away and allowed to ferment. And so we had these corns on the farm. We were keeping cattle as well, and we also had some of the early trials with non-GMO varieties. And yeah, as Todd said, those cows were instantly going straight to all the non-GMO corn and leaving the Roundup Ready stuff until they didn't have any other choices of what to eat, right? They don't know what it means to spray Roundup. They just know what they're staring at and what they're smelling, right? So there's something there. You got to give them credit where credit is due. They know something about it, I guess. And I think we know enough to know that we'd rather not spray that on the things that we're going to eat and drink.
Yep. Yeah, and for a long time, behavior has waxed and waned. But yeah, I think if someone saw that happen to food right before you ate it, like you see someone spray pesticide on something and they, hey, would you like a strawberry? Be like, no. Like, well, when you spray it in advance and the plant's either going to leach it in or it's going to go into the water source, and it's so I think so either way, animals that are seemingly tapped more into their senses maybe than we are paying attention seem to know the difference between the two and something we need to think carefully about.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to think carefully about it, for sure. I mean, you are what you eat.
Yeah, I mean, 100%.
You are what you drink.
Yeah. And so finally on my end, so like I guess you guys recently the team came back from California and got a couple of trophies. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Craft Maltsters Guild, sort of a trade group here in the United States. They're trade alliance for maltsters, which is really cool. They host an annual competition, 6 years running now, of they call the Malt Cup, and this year they judged 6 categories of malt: Pilsner malt, pale malt, Munich malt, wheat malt, caramel malt. What am I missing? I think Vienna malt.
Okay.
We picked up a gold for the wheat malt. We picked up a gold for the Munich malt, and a bronze medal for our pale malt, which is pretty cool to medal in 3 categories. Pretty exciting times. I mean, I guess, you know, where I would leave folks is that, you know, I think Root Shoot's awesome. I work here. I think we're doing some really cool things. We're not alone in that. You know, if you aren't near Root Shoot, right, you probably are near somebody who's trying to do this kind of good work on behalf of the land, on behalf of quality beverage. Find them. There may be some farmers in your area who are interested in diversifying what they're doing, who would be interested in potentially even allocating acreage to you as a producer if you know your needs in advance. You know, there's going to be some kinks to work through and some understanding that you're dealing with a farmer, not a wholesaler. But find them. They want to work with you. They want to get out from under commodity if they're able to. They want to form those relationships that, you know, with producers, reliable relationships. And they want to help you make better food and beverage, like they do. Find them. They're out there.
Yeah, and you know, for the distillers and bartenders, ultimately, is the end users that the distillers are making product for, to an extent. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like right now, many of the trends are that people are like the caliber of product is going up out mm-hmm. there.
Oh, it sure is.
And to that end, if you are looking to kind of be able to further compete based on flavor, you need to go further up the supply chain to find better original ingredients. Because I imagine you're quite the magician in your distilling, kind of setting. But at the same time, like, you know, the quality of the product is so important. And yeah, just even like, again, the thing that I will leave with from today is also like, we talk about, you know, these other things as terroir driven. It's not that grains aren't, we just haven't treated them that way going past. And that kind of gets back to the whole cyclical thing of how are you caring for the land and what are the farming practices there.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have an agricultural product here inside of a bottle of whiskey.
Yep.
Right? That is the essence of agricultural product. It's easy to lose sight of that. I totally agree. I mean, I feel like folks are a little more able to draw that direct connection with like a glass of wine because you can understand the idea of fruit juice and juicing a fruit and getting to wine in that way. And for something like beer is maybe a step further, and maybe something like whiskey is even a step further. And so there's like a little bit more of a mental disconnect, but connect those dots, man. We've got we're in an agricultural industry, and we prize sort of a consistent product. Being able to open a bottle and understand that you know what it's going to taste like year after year, despite the fact that the seasons change and that this year's summer may have been quite a bit drier than last year's summer, and that the barley that we harvested was impacted by that. That speaks to the skill of the producers in the intermediary. That speaks to your maltster. That speaks to your distiller, who are able to take varying ingredients over time and produce something that you perceive as consistent. That's hard, and it's really cool.
And to be able to have a direct relationship where you can talk to the farmer about like, okay, like, do I need to think as I'm working through this, grain this year. Do I need to think about this differently as I am fermenting and distilling it? And again, since they have worked that product right there directly, they can better advise you on that, as opposed to the wholesalers. Like, how many pounds do you want, or whatever. Like we were talking about bushels earlier is the agricultural term, but which lay people again like me are like, what's a bushel? But anyways, but being able to have that direct conversation is understand, like, how do I think about this year's harvest compared to last year's? Much like, again, in wine, we're used to, this was there's no reason grains can't have that year too, that they're more abundant versus more stressed.
Absolutely. Yeah. We live that every day. It's great. 23 was a great year, by the way.
Really?
There you have it.
Okay. There you have it. Well, Heyward, thanks so much for taking time. This has been great.
Yeah, for sure. Appreciate you.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are 2 great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter. Or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.